Well, what the hell happened at the Pentagon on 9/11? Was it a large aircraft being piloted by a Muslim terrorist who had almost no flight training experience whatsoever, and even advanced pilots who spent 30 years piloting aircraft couldn't pull off this maneuver? Was it a missile that hit the Pentagon? Was it a small aircraft that hit the Pentagon? What exactly hit the Pentagon? And why are we being lied to about what happened on that day? Our next guest was an infantryman assigned to Alpha Company, the 3rd U.S. Infantry, Adam Eisenberg. He spent approximately 240 hours on site at the Pentagon between September 11th and the 30th. He was engaged in what was known at the time as Operation Noble Eagle, which is our nation's initial response to what happened at the Pentagon, you might recall. In addition to spending considerable time at the Pentagon, Adam witnessed a series, I think what he would call anomalies that happened during that time, before and after the event, which of course has inspired a massive amount of investigation and research that he has now in many ways devoted his life to getting answers for all of us, what he calls the Orion Project, to get to the bottom of this. And Adam has been kind enough to join us here on the show to continue down and get answers about what happened on 9/11. Adam, great to have you here on Redacted.
Great to be here, Clayton. Thank you so much for having me and for also all that you're doing right now to promote 9/11 Truth. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And, we wouldn't be able to do this without courageous individuals who are putting their name, their livelihood on the line by coming forward. But I think we've made some progress because I think, years ago when we first started looking at this, there were people they were called conspiracy nuts, 9/11 truthers. They were lambasted. And we just got through a week, recently here on the 9/11 anniversary where we have sitting members of U.S. Congress, Senator Johnson, former, Congressman Dennis Kucinich, Kurt Weldon, and others who are really moving this ball forward in a big, big way, trying to bring, perhaps testimony in front of Congress, in front of a new investigation. So I think we're making some headway. Would you say so?
Absolutely think so. And, all the things that we've witnessed in the last 20 years certainly didn't do our country any justice, but we can now see the way that these members of the cabal operate. And so now that we can point to a lot of different things, we now have mainstream attention, and I think it's fantastic.
So can you just take me back to that day and how you wound up at the Pentagon? In what kind of capacity were you there?
Sure. So my company was the Old Guard, and my testimony is one of several hundred because we had several hundred people responding to the event. That day we were over at Fort Myer. We were preparing for a show called The Spirit of America, where we basically toured the country. It was kind of an outreach event where we showed the country what the military and the Army was really getting into. And so that was happening at the time. We were not at our base. Our base was Fort McNair. Full disclosure, I was not at the Pentagon when it got hit, but we were a part of the initial response to that event. And so we had to get back to our base once we figured out things were happening. That proved to be very difficult. And prior to ever going on site, I witnessed, as Clayton mentioned, my first anomaly. We knew that we were getting deployed to the Pentagon. We just didn't know when exactly that was going to happen on 9/11. But the first thing that made me really scratch my head was that I was ordered to go out and perform guard detail at Fort McNair. And in doing so, I basically went down to check out my M16, and I was not given any live rounds, and I wasn't given any ammunition whatsoever to do that. So I was handed a blank magazine and told, here you go out and report to guard detail. And I'm not the only person that can say that. I was able to find research testimony where others in my unit, my specific company, were not given ammunition. And so that's one of the first things that I saw.
Would you normally have been? Would that have been normal?
I would say so, simply because the other research I've been able to do into other units and facilities around the DC area, I have seen where they were given ammunition and there were people out in civilian clothes holding shotguns, things like that. Even the military police in my unit weren't given any additional ammunition that day prior to going on site. So that was a head scratcher. And I've been trying to figure out if that was a company decision, if that was a regimental decision. But that was really the first place where I started to see that something really wasn't making any sense.
So you're not handed ammunition, you're not given live rounds, you're given an empty magazine, and you're told then what? Go and do what?
So I had to go to the front gate of Fort McNair, where we basically beefed up the MP security force. Other people were doing roaming guard around the base, but I was told to go to the front gate. And I asked the MP, I said, "Did they give you any additional rounds?" They didn't give me anything. And she said, "No, I only have a few rounds for my pistol, and that's it." So I didn't know what really to expect at that point in time. I just knew that if there was going to be an additional attack in our base, I really couldn't do very much about it. And so that's the way it went until about early afternoon. Then we went on site at the Pentagon around 4 o'clock. So
Now, as I understand it from your notes, you were forced to sign a non-disclosure agreement
that's
before going
correct.
to the Pentagon? What?
That's correct. People in my unit were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. I have not been able to get this non-disclosure agreement, but if we're in the process of going to an emergency, regardless of what part of the building we are going to be going into, because it was known that the Defense Intelligence Agency and that portion of the building did have some classified stuff. But still, that was a head scratcher for us. You know, we weren't given ammunition to perform guard detail, and now when we're trying to respond to this terrible incident, we're told to sign non-disclosure agreement. And what makes that even more interesting is that not everybody in the unit signed one of those. So some people can remember signing those, and some people can't. I haven't been able to get my hands on that document, but I would love to see what we were basically saying that we wouldn't talk about.
Did the 9/11 Commission interview you at all based on your experience at the Pentagon?
No, in fact, when you look up members of our unit, they don't speak a lot in the official documents about our role there and how we arrived there. And so getting those answers has proven to be a very interesting and difficult task through FOIA requests. And part of my research is going to show the many different types of responses I've been getting from these agencies, where it's said that, you know, documents are referenced in the after action reports. And so we're not mentioned in the premier after action reports, so it doesn't surprise me that we're really not discussed in the 9/11 Commission report either.
So now you show up on site. Now there's famous video from CNN and others, but I believe the main video is from CNN, and I just want to play it here because this is the response of the reporter who's on site at the time. And he's being interviewed. I forget the name of Judy Woodruff, I think, was interviewing him at the time and asking, what did he see? And he says, he doesn't see any sign of there being an aircraft that hit the building. Watch.
Actually, it was Bob Franken with an eyewitness who said it appeared that Boeing 757, the American Airlines jet, landed short of the Pentagon. Can you give us any better idea of how much of the plane actually impacted the building?
It might have appeared that way, but from my close-up inspection, there's no evidence of a plane having crashed anywhere near the Pentagon. The only site is the actual site of the building that's crashed in, and as I said, the only pieces left that you can see are small enough that you could pick up in your hand. There are no large tail sections, wing sections, a fuselage, nothing like that anywhere around, which would indicate that the entire plane crashed into the side of the Pentagon and then caused the side to collapse. Now, even though if you look at the pictures of the Pentagon, you see that the floors have all collapsed, that didn't happen immediately. It wasn't until almost about 45 minutes later that the structure was weakened.
Okay, so that was on CNN. Of course, they tried to bury this video, but we're happy to resurface it for them. When you arrived on scene, what did you see?
I looked over at what allegedly was a plane impact into a building. And I'm going to say that the first thing that I noticed, because at the time, I had no idea that our government was capable of doing something like this, and I don't think very many people did. But to quote a very close Alpha Company buddy of mine, and this is an official reference document, Matthew Colton, he basically just said, I expected to see more. We expected to see a lot more damage. We expected to see aeronautical parts all over the place. We expected to see a lawn that was totally destroyed. That's just the expectations, I guess, that one could see or think that they would see based on a very large commercial aircraft impacting a building, exploding, all this stuff happening. And it was very small. No picture really does the actual whole justice. And at that point in time, the building had already collapsed. At that point, the portion of the building where the plane allegedly hit was collapsed. And so it made it look even smaller at that point in time. And so we were right outside of where the hole was, where this allegedly happened. And we were kind of back a little bit ways. We were less than 100 feet away from where it happened, and just not what we'd expected. I expected a totally different scene.
Now we should point out, I think it's, I think it's important for our audience to understand this, that this wasn't like you didn't know anything about airplanes, right? When you're walking up to this hole there, part of Alpha Company, you perhaps have more experience than pretty much anyone else. Like if you grabbed a group of 100 people and asked them to describe different parts of an airplane, I think you're going to stand out like a sore thumb because you know these things inside and out. Can you talk about your aero parts experience, your aeronautical parts experience, and why you knew what to look for?
Sure. Well, I have to be very careful when I say this. The aeronautical parts experience came down the line. So it was kind of like fate's way of saying, you don't believe that a plane hit that building. Now we're going to give you proximity and we're going to make you an expert in these types of parts because I worked in a facility where Pratt& Whitney housed their aeronautical parts. Well, the two types of engines on the Boeing 757-200 series plane. One of them is a Pratt& Whitney engine, the other one's a Rolls-Royce engine. And so the Rolls-Royce engine was the one that was allegedly on Flight 77. But I say that because I have kind of an interesting feather in my cap. I've got that experience as a parts specialist in this facility. So I'm very familiar with how to handle parts, what they look like prior to being fabricated into engines. And I can just say without a shred of doubt, that what we pulled out of that building, and we pulled everything out of that building over the course of time there, we weren't pulling out airplane parts. There's absolutely no way.
What were you pulling out?
I would say office furniture, every single possible thing that was in that building. We absolutely pulled it out. And that's the thing. We can look to reference documents like Firefight right here. This is a document that talks about the different things that the firefighters were doing. Well, in the acknowledgement of that book, it point blank says that the first responders that were there and the people that were allegedly looking for airplane parts didn't know what they were really looking for. They would hold something up and say, airplane part, and they would say, oh yeah, airplane part, and they would put it into piles. Everything got shifted to the north parking lot where it basically was sifted through, trying to find additional evidence. And we were also a part of that as well. So we were in the building, we were in the north parking lot doing things. We were also pulling security in the early days. We were involved with talking to the family members about the details of the things that were being found. So we were quite involved there.
So maybe you can, before we go more deeply into this, maybe you can explain, like, what is the official narrative? What are we all told happened that day?
Well, we're told that. So at the Pentagon, we're told that, Flight 77 was hijacked. It pulled out of Dulles, and it basically was taken over not long into the flight, and that these five radical Islamic terrorists, one of which couldn't even fly the plane that was said to, that he was flying. He wasn't capable of even really flying a Cessna or landing a Cessna, that he was able to turn around and then head into Washington, D.C. You would think that if we were going to run a plane into the Pentagon, that we would go straight there and go down, but they didn't do that. Took a nice leisurely flight around D.C., pulled a corkscrew, maneuver where he basically took this plane down thousands of feet and then flew it, precisely into this very, heavily defended building. And people don't even realize that, commercial airliners at that speed, they can't even fly that low. And so it's all a mystery. And we even know that when we look into the Dulles airport, we can't get any positive identification that these individuals were actually even in that airport on September 11th. Brenda Brown, the American Airlines ticket agent, said that she didn't see any Middle Eastern looking men. And, there's hundreds of cameras in Dulles. We only got one. And there's consensus among the 9/11, truth community that there's problems with these videos. And there's 300 of them plus at Dulles. And we only get one several years down the road where there's no timestamp. There's speed issues with it. And so that's really the official narrative, that these planes were hijacked, that they were flown into, the Pentagon. And that ultimately, they did that because they hate us, they hate our freedoms. And, I say differently. I think that it was a false flag incident that was used to invade another part of the world. So
Oh, I think 100. Well, you're speaking to the choir here, Adam, which is absolutely this is one of the largest false flag operations in world history. I mean, and we know the history of false flag operations. Why they continue to use them is because they work. They rally us. You know, we tie yellow ribbons around trees. We all feel that sense of that common enemy, you know, and Osama bin Laden or whatever. We can all rally around one particular name, and we can do all. Yet there's no evidence to suggest that Muslims flew these planes at all or carried out these incredible attacks on the United States. So I'm 100% agree with you on that. So then, what about the airplane? Because a lot of people say, well, what happened to the families that were on these planes? You know, we heard, I forget it was. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So if that flight, if it wasn't an airplane that hit it, or it wasn't Flight 77 that hit it, or who knows exactly, I guess we'll get to that in a moment, but you're just pulling out office furniture. I mean, are you finding furniture? Bodies? Are you finding perfectly kept passports that didn't burn? Like, what are you finding?
So great question. I make no bones about it. The bodies that I saw, and again, 240 hours from the 11th to the 30th. So, I mean, we were in there quite a bit for a long period of time. Everything that I found looked as if it was a body that was inside the building at the time of the alleged impact. I never saw any bodies that looked like they were in an airplane. And furthermore, I challenge anybody in the FBI to release the documents, or not the documents, excuse me, the photographs of what we saw. I've asked these agencies for these things. I say to them basically, I was there. You trusted me to go in at that time. I would like to see the crime scene documents because I want to prove that what we were basically doing was just kind of separating everything that was inside the building, and that was really it. I never saw any personal effects that looked like luggage. I don't know how we've gotten to this point, and we can look at all this evidence and have people that were on total gallop, and we still are here so many years later, still trying to figure it out.
It's got to be so frustrating. I mean, for you there witnessing this, seeing all these anomalies, you're not finding luggage, you're not finding bodies from an airplane, you're not finding any airplane parts. So what the hell do you think hit the Pentagon? I mean, was there any evidence of a missile? Was there evidence? Because I've seen reports from others who've been following this for very many years saying that they believed it was a small aircraft, like a small jet that, like you would think like a fighter jet that flew into the Pentagon. Any evidence of that? Any evidence of a missile? What do you think you found?
Well, I think missiles explode tremendously, and the inside of the building still had a lot of form in a lot of ways. And the scene that stuck with me the most, and this is why I say, I don't know what does these. This sounds something specialized, but there was a conference room that was not along the alleged path of the 757, and the people that were in this conference room were still kind of sitting in their chairs. Some of their faces were burned and badly burned at that. Some melted, some of it was not. And the details around the room, the room was still pretty much there. I mean, it was put together. There was no evidence of explosion. But I found a testimony, and this came from a Arlington County firefighter, a captain by the name of Charles Gibbs. He was the training captain, and he said, we were finding people that would look like they were asleep. And I mean, I'm talking like this, and it's, that's a captain that was in charge of the training wing that has seen everything. And he basically then said in this testimony that the Department of Defense had people there and said, well, that's what happens when explosions occur. And so, I of course can't look at a lot of different, scenarios and say, this is a similar aircraft, crash, but if you look at other airplane crashes, you're going to find a pretty significant difference. And so I always say, I don't know what exactly it was, but I do know it wasn't a Boeing 757. And furthermore, I have to say, this is a fantastic question for people like Aldo Marquis and Craig Reinke of the Citizen Investigation Team. They're pretty much the first pioneers that were interviewing witnesses. And they prove, and Craig McKee was talking about this. I'm not sure why Craig was brought in to talk about it, but they proved that there's a north approach and there's a south approach. And the second that witnesses start talking about a north to the Citgo approach, it's all over. And so I believe personally it was something
Wait a minute,
inside.
can you go back? I'm sorry, I want to
Sure.
understand that better. When witnesses start talking about a north approach, meaning
North of the Citgo gas station, that something came in north of the Citgo gas station, when in fact the official narrative states that whatever came in, the Boeing 757 came from south of the Citgo gas station and hit the Pentagon going over 500 miles an hour. So, that's where I absolutely say you got to start listening to those witness testimonies. But then I have to give a shout out to Xander Arena. You've interviewed him before, and he was also speaking at the DC event. There's not a better technical breakdown than what he has done, and he's also years ago his research proved that what was released from the video cameras was a mathematical impossibility. And so he is basically taking evidence that's totally open source information, and he's working with AI, and he's doing a number of great things. I highly check out, if you guys haven't heard his presentation, to do so. But that's the thing, I try to put my finger on what it was, but I say, we don't have to really figure it out. As soon as we know it's not a Boeing 757-200 series airplane, that's really a wrap. And the witness testimonies that say it was, I challenge people to listen to those, because if you have children and you know what happens when little kids lie, the story gets kind of crazier and crazier as things go. So that's another way to kind of break down the crime scene.
what's interesting about these flights, these alleged flights, that they were fairly empty. I mean, it'd be weird on a Monday for these flights to be that empty in these like high profile corridors, DC, New York, Boston, et cetera, to have these so few passengers on these flights. So that piece of the story has always bothered me. And when people say, Shanksville, Pennsylvania story as it relates to the Pentagon. So is there any relationship that you want to draw maybe between what was happening in Pennsylvania and Shanksville, also not finding any aircraft parts? Where is the fuselage? They suddenly miraculously find the black box right as investigators are going to show up and hold a press conference. Like, it's all very convenient, but very anomalous given normal types of airplane crashes, Shanksville, Pennsylvania. But there seems to be a connection between the two of them, or at least that's what we're told anyway, that there's some sort of connection between the Pentagon and Shanksville. What do you say?
I say it's really interesting. The only connection that I make there is I look at the way that the agents were dressed when they were picking up all these parts and all this gear and all this stuff. And then I see the agents that were picking up the parts at the Pentagon, and they were totally, out there in office ties and just put things into bags. And so I don't know. I look at the protocol and the way that they did things there, and I scratch my head. And again, where's this airplane? They say that it hit the ground and all of a sudden just evaporated. Have a very difficult time believing that.
Right. I mean, how many airplane crashes have we covered over the years in the news business? And there's always material. There's a debris field. There's a massive debris field. There's a fuselage. There's wings. But no, in Pennsylvania, none of that, of course. So,
well, the Arlington firefighters, even Air Florida Flight 90, that's pretty much what totally kind of set the stage for DC and Virginia's regional response. And if you look into that air crash, I mean, sure, hit a bridge going, a lot slower, but they were pulling pieces of wreckage, very big pieces of wreckage out of the river there. So, why do we see wreckage at these other instances and not there?
Let's go back to the Pentagon. So you're there for that length of time from September 11th through the 30th of September, continuing to pull bodies and pieces and office furniture out of there, but no aircraft parts. I mean, did you ever find any aircraft parts at all?
No question. And this isn't just something where, down the road, I was kind of thinking to myself, oh, maybe I'll start to pursue this. I was saying from very early on, and there's soldiers that were in my unit that will testify to this in my book. I've been saying that this was something different than an airline attack for quite some time. So no airline parts, no nothing.
So pretty much across Alpha Company, pretty much across your entire group of how many total of you were there in your company there for this effort?
The whole entire company came, as long as you weren't engaged in another form of mission. The whole regiment, actually. So there was over 100 people from our company alone. The records that I've been able to get show that between 600 and 700 people were on site from the old guard as soon as they could get there. So in my study of the event, I found that there's really three categories of people. The vast majority of people fall into my camp where they don't remember seeing anything. The other second group, the second highest group, I guess you could say, they've compartmentalized it. They've kind of forgotten about a lot of the details. And then there's a very small group of people that claim that they saw parts. And I asked them, okay, what type of parts did you see? And he said, well, I think I saw a chair. I said, okay, did you see any other chairs? No. Do you think it was an office chair? How confident are you that it was an airline chair? And he's like, well, I don't know. And then another person claimed that they saw an airliner door. And I say, do you have any experiences with these types of things? No. We can't really find, any evidence that there was a door anywhere. And furthermore, when you start to look for these parts, we can't find them. And not only that, I can show with my research a lot of anomalies surrounding the parts, and that the FBI actually didn't have chain of custody of these things, and that there were other agencies that did. And the weirdest story that I got, which came from, this book right here, showed that old guard soldiers were actually being given DEA T-shirts and asked to don them while they were moving these parts in Isuzu box trucks that were barely operable to DEA facilities and to government facilities, which is strange because these parts were allegedly around, jet fuel and asbestos and human remains, and they were supposed to remain in basically in the care of the FBI so that they could not contaminate anything else. So that's also one of the components of my work is I look at the anomalies surrounding the parts because I was a parts specialist. So several questions come up there too.
Right, or in the NTSB, right? I mean, why? It's the same question I have about why all the steel on 9/11 at the Twin Towers was just shipped to China right after the attack. Like, yeah, maybe we should hang on to that stuff and do an analysis. No, let's send it to China. Okay.
Yeah.
I should point out that your company, as far as I understand it, was also the target of the anthrax attacks that happened shortly thereafter. And there's no record of witness testimonies as well. So like there's a lot of anomalies about your service, about your company's involvement in this, like military records vanished and you guys were targeted by the anthrax attacks. Can you talk about this?
Sure. So after the event, company went back to normal operations. We were starting to get life back in order. And then all of a sudden, our mail room downstairs in our basement was basically blocked off. And there was a company formation. We were told that that anthrax had basically been sent to our specific company. And so nobody really got very much more than that. All I know is that our mail started to go through this different process where they were basically sending it through this search device. That went on for a few weeks, and then all of a sudden, everything kind of went back to normal. We weren't given very many details, and then that was it. The mail kind of started coming back in normal. It didn't look like it was going through some process of being searched that basically literally melted it. But that was a big deal because a lot of guys were traumatized from that event. They didn't know what was going on. So it's like, okay, we just cleaned up the Pentagon from a terrorist attack, and now you're telling me that we're getting attacked in our base with anthrax. And what makes that situation even more interesting is that I believe the FBI said it was one of their own that got to blame for that. But in all of the anthrax reports and everything, there is nothing public that talks about an anthrax attack at Fort McNair in Washington, D.C. I do have my fellow companymen that have testified, and I used one of these testimonies in a VA case. But that is highly suspect. And the only thing that my research buddies and I could kind of come up with is maybe they wanted to get into our mail. Maybe they wanted to further kind of terrorize us a little bit. And who knows, that really is it. But none of the other companies in my regiment went through that, just my company. So very strange.
So who do you think is responsible for this? Because
Ooh.
For people initially in the first few years, people say, oh, that's conspiracy theorists, that it was like the deep state or there was a government within a government or that it was the Israelis working with the United States government in collusion to start a forever war, which, I think, well, anyway, I won't lead the witness, but what has your research led you to believe?
Well, and we'll get to this in a second. Down the road, I started to speak out about the event, and as a first responder and a witness to the event, I felt like I could say something, I could offer something to the public. And when I started to do that about 4.5 years ago, one specific witness to the event started to basically respond to me and offer his thoughts. And so, going back to your question about who was responsible for the anthrax attack, ultimately, I have to kind of look at the individuals that I point to down the road, the ones that I stumbled into that are responsible for the event. We have people like Tulsi Gabbard that goes on Modern Wisdom and talks about the cabal and who is really running things despite who gets elected. And so my research shows, and it's without question, that these individuals are likely in the FBI, they're likely in the CIA, the DIA, the DEA, and several other agencies that basically have to do with intelligence. And so, these individuals that I stumbled into down the road, they were specialized weapons experts. And I've basically been able to, for the last 5 years, get them on record saying a lot of things. So the anthrax attack, not really sure, but overall responsibility for that day and what's been occurring since, I have a pretty good idea where an investigation should begin.
Inside the government, inside the three-letter agencies?
Yes, sir. That is correct.
All for what purpose? Is it what the outcome that we got? The massive increase in the military-industrial complex, the doing the bidding of Benjamin Netanyahu and removing Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, and of course Iran will come next. We will be complicit in that as well. Those were the big three. We got the two regime change operations in Iraq, and of course a massive expansion of the military-industrial complex, trillions of dollars and millions of lives lost. Is that the outcome they wanted and they got?
Well, I think we also have to speak about the NSA and the security state and everything that's happened in the last 20 years, especially with where we're sitting right now and the administration that's currently in, and just the type of ties to certain areas in the world that are being established. And I got to say this, you guys, I wanted to say this earlier. I was talking to Clayton about this. Don't get my last name twisted, you guys. I'm not Jewish, and I despise Zionism. I despise it. So there's a lot that's happening in the world right now that has to do with Israel and America. So I just had to get that out of there, you guys. This is not one of those circumstances where I'm just trying to be out here, playing games. This has been something I've been at for 5 years, and you nailed it, Clayton. I think that ultimately this was used as our kind of like Operation Northwoods says. This was our, Operation Northwoods, where it allowed us to get into a region to start doing the bidding. Weapons of mass destruction and all these other things were a lie. And I'm sure you could have a number of geopolitical players on that can give you all the nuts and bolts there, but ultimately, look what's happened since that event occurred, and the number of lives that have been changed, the way that the country has been changed, and just the totally divided nature of where we are now, and one part of the region of the world that seems to be behind it. And so it's a shame, and I really wish Americans would connect the dots quickly. So,
no, there's a lot of Americans are wearing blinders, but a lot of Americans have awakened, and I think I don't think we're able to put that genie back in the bottle, and I think that's why they're panicking. I think that's why these globalists. I think that's why Benjamin Netanyahu is panicking. The deep state cabal is panicking.